All right, Larry, well, we just saw you break down that carcass when it was hanging on the gambrel, and now we've got it so you can work on it on a table, and we're going to take these into pieces that are going to be ready for packaging and consuming later this fall.
Yep, and what I always like to emphasize is you don't need a fancy butcher shop or anything. You can see this is just my garage. That's where my cars, my vehicles all are. And keep your tables clean. They always say 1 ounce of bleach in a gallon of water sanitizes any bacteria. So I like to wash down all my equipment before I start doing any operation with that solution of 1 ounce of bleach to a gallon of water. So you want to make sure your stuff stays clean. So these are our tenderloins, and as you can see, they're very much like we just took them out of the animal earlier. And there's two parts to them. As you can see, there's the smaller part, which is not the steak quality meat. And you want to look for the fatty or bloodshot pieces on there. Take that, discard it, and then this would become your trim. It's always nice to keep your trim bucket or whatever you're using, box or cooler, nice and handy so you don't have to have a chance of things falling on the floor, and it's nice and close to your work area.
Sure. So, and again, yeah, these tenderloins, because they're on the inside of the body cavity, they had more of a chance to get exposed to contaminants, and so that's why, again, it's a great piece of meat, but you want to keep the best part great by getting rid of the stuff that's been contaminated.
So as you can see, we have the two tenderloins nicely cleaned up, and these are ready for the frying pan or packaging. So I'm going to set our cuts over here and then keep moving on with the next one. So now you have your back straps. As you can see on the back side, they call this the silver skin, and because it's silver, and that stuff is something you don't want in your frying pan because you'd chew forever. And again, everything has its tiny little seam, so you lay it in a bit of a stretch, take your knife, run it along, and you'll see where it separates right here. You can work your knife along that, and it's not a high pressure thing. This is where you're talking about your fillet knife, and that's a great use for something like that. It's got the delicate touch. You can feel when the blade's bending a little bit. And this is where a good sharp knife comes in. So you work your knife down to the level of that silver skin, hold the angle, and right there's your silver skin. So here again, this is a really quality piece of meat. And so what you want to do is store it and prepare and have everything ready for the freezer where you're going to maintain the maximum quality of the meat. So a lot of people like to cut their steaks in advance and then put the cuts in the freezer. However, every time you make a cut in that meat, you're exposing it to more air in the freezer, and when it thaws, more juice or moisture is going to escape from that muscle. So you're going to end up with a drier steak. What I always like to do is, whatever portion your family or whoever's going to be consuming it, take the whole loin in that portion and put that in your backpack bag or your Ziploc bag or whatever you're going to do. So the other thing that people really like to enjoy is a butterfly backstrap, and that's probably one of the most famous cuts. However, there's a lot of people that don't fully understand how to cut the meat. So what you want to do is, this is the inside of your backstrap where the silver skin was, and it's very smooth, as you can see. That's the back side of your backstrap. You lay it backside down. What I always take the small tail, I'll cut it off because that's what I'm going to cook, very much similar to what I did my tenderloins. And to do the butterfly steak, if you want them 1 inch thick, you cut 3/4 to 7/8 of the way through on one cut, and the second one all the way. And you lay them open. So you take it again, I like them 1 inch thick. Sometimes I make them a little bit thicker. You cut them about 3/4 to 7/8 of the way through, the second one all the way, flip them open, and you have your butterfly steak. So I'm going to take this loin, put it off to the side so we can keep working. And this is the second back strap. Same thing as before, lay it down, follow your seams all the way through.
So this part is very similar to skinning a fish.
Right, and that's where you're talking about the knives again. Having a knife that you can feel the edge, and that's what they talk about, a fillet knife or something a little bit flexible. You can feel whether you're cutting into the sinew or you're cutting into the muscle.
So this is the part I'm really looking forward to, because when I get into the hind, I know there's certain cuts, but every year, because I only do it once, I always start from scratch as far as which the most strategic way to go about these hindquarters.
So the first thing, again, just like I said earlier, you take the pieces that you don't want and get them out of your way. There's a joint right here. You can take your knife, put it in there, get to your edge of your table. So this is where we're going to take our hinds apart. So you can see, you look where the moving parts are. There's a ball and socket joint on both sides of the hip. Again, you can get rid of some of the extra, the waste material that might be there. And all this extra, the sinew stuff that you cut off now, you won't have to cut off later. As I explained earlier, when the animal's taunt or stretched out, you can do these removal things of that finer tissue a lot easier. As soon as you start cutting it, the muscles contract, now it's bunched up and it's harder to take those fine parts out.
Yeah.
So now we're going to separate our hinds from the hip. So you cut right down the middle, you start following the bones, and you can sort of feel where the bones go. And you can already see right here, I don't know if you can see that, Jeff, where the ball and socket's already exposed. There's a cord that attaches that, and as soon as you have that exposed, you can take the tip of your knife, cut it, and it sort of falls right apart. And just, it's like tracing the bones.
And this is so much easier to do in this position than when it's still hanging. Again, another thing I do, I'm trying to get it down as small as I can right from the gambrel. So I'm trying to get that hind off while it's still hanging, and I'm not going to do that anymore.
So now we're going to take apart the different muscles of the hind quarter. What I like to do is take the shank off first. There's a joint. If you hit it just right, there it is. And just wiggle your knife, it'll fall right through. The blade will follow the ripples of the joint. That hind leg will come right out. So on the hind leg, you'll see a lot of this cartilage. There again, if you just take it off as you go, it makes your life a little bit easier in the end. So there's 4 main muscles to the round. There's a tip, an inside, a bottom, and an eye. And I like to take it apart in a 3-piece method. I start with the tip. A lot of people will call that, it looks like a football, and I've heard people say they like the football roast.
Okay.
So you start, and this would be the front of the leg. This is the back of the deer, this is the front. So you start right by that ball and socket joint, the ball part. You'll see another little bone come apart there. And you can see there's a seam that'll expose itself. It just fell apart there. And once you get it to that point, I like to take this little bone out first. And again, you can use your fingers instead of your knife and hook. And this piece is called the tip of the round. It's a very high quality piece of meat from the round. It has several different cords in it, but these are softer cords that actually cook down. They're not as chewy as some of the other cords that we've been seeing.
Okay. However I came about doing it, mine looks like that when I'm done too.
So the next piece we're going to take is the inside round. They call it the inside because it's on the inside of the round. And again, you cut down your bone, you see this seam start to appear, and you just trace it. The other thing that people like to have a concern with is getting the lymph nodes out of your meat. There's 6 main places in the skeletal muscle where you'll find a lymph node, and they're always encased in fat. So this is your inside. Right here you have your eye of the round and your bottom. And if you look at it as it's still attached to the bone, right here is going to be your lymphatic tissue, or your lymph nodes. And a good way to tell what you have is inside the fat, you'll see a grayish color exposed tissue, and that's called the lymph nodes.
So the lymphatic system is the part of any mammal's body that is kind of the disease fighter. And so we have lymph nodes, when you're having a cold or something and you can feel them in your neck, whether it's potentially chronic wasting disease, which of course is something that we want to guard against that exposure, but even a bacterial infection or anything like that the animal has, it's going to be concentrated in the lymphatic system. So when you come across those lymph nodes, that's good awareness to remove that from the meat that's going to be going into your products.
So this is the inside round that we had taken out a little bit earlier, and now we're going to peel it out and get it down to the single largest skeletal muscle in the animal that has absolutely no cords is the inside round. This is one of the things that people way underestimate, and I learned as a meat cutter years ago that the tenderest cut is the tenderloin and then the backstraps, but the most flavorful muscle in the entire animal is the inside round. And you can see everything comes off very nicely in seams. And you just clean it up to get all the fatty tissue off.
When I was a teenager and we would cut up our venison as a family, we had the mistake of thinking that just as with beef, a little bit of fat and tallow stuff marbled in there is going to add flavor, and the end product we had, quite frankly, wasn't very good. I didn't enjoy the venison that I ate as a teenager because I ended up with this greasy coating in my mouth, and I just thought, well, that's just eating venison. And I learned later that there's a fundamental difference between how fat exists in beef and in venison. And from your background, you should be able to explain that better than I.
It's something really unique, but every animal fat melts at a different temperature. And beef fat and hog fat and lamb fat melts at a relatively low temperature versus venison fat. And venison fat melts at about the same temperature of a human body, 98, 99 degrees. And what happens is that layer you feel, that's the fat not completely melting, so it's coating your mouth versus going down your stomach with the rest of the food.
Mm-hmm. And so that, unlike beef, when you're going through this process, if it's white, if it's fatty, it's going in that's the discard pile.
So there's two other pieces left on our round now. As I pointed out, we have the eye in the bottom, and right here is the actual sirloin butt. The tenderloin piece came out with the loin and the tenderloin, and this is the butt part of the sirloin. And this actually makes a very good cut. Even though you can see there's some fine lines of cords in there, this again, similar to the tip of the round, the cords dissolve easier, and it makes a very good cut for a steak. What people don't always understand is following the grain of the meat. When anytime you cut a steak, you want to cut it cross grain. So you got to sort of study the way the fibers are formed. And if you can look real close, the lines here are all going like this in all the muscles. So when you cut your steaks, you want to cut it crossways. Mm-hmm. Piece of meat we're cutting now, the bottom and the eye is the lowest quality of the round. And this is something where I like to use it in a steak, like a Swiss steak or something I'm going to simmer for a relatively long time versus a grill. Unless I'm shot or harvested a fawn, that meat, all the rounds going to be very tender. So you want to get this really heavy silver skin off. And just like to flame the fish, the skin off, it's the same thing using your edge. And that you can discard because that's like chewing rubber bands. And like, if you see every time I slap a piece down and I grab the end, that means I'm going to be taking off the backside skin. And that's your eye and the bottom of your round. Now we're going to take apart the front part of our animal. And there's not a whole lot left here in quality other than what I had pointed out earlier, this nice piece of roast. So again, if you want to work on some of the heavier cords while it's on the outside, as you can see, you can sort of strip it off the surface. And then again, everything has a joint that you need to follow and seams. So you start what I like to call the elbow, cut down to the bone, work your way up to the next one, sort of feel that joint, and it sort of rolls. Obviously, if you take this and you give it some outward pressure, as you hit that joint, it's going to roll right out. And up in here is what you have called the paddle bone. It actually looks like a canoe paddle, and there's a ridge here, and you can feel it with your finger. You take your knife, trace both sides of it. And this is, I call finessing the muscle out. You just use a little gentle pressure and trace the bone. And this is the largest muscle that you're going to have on the front quarter. And you can just clean up the outside a little bit. And this makes a really nice chunk for a roast.
Sure.
And while this is going to be a separate little piece, these two pieces always go in my slow cooker together.
That's what I was just thinking. That's slow cooker material right there. So this is an adult deer and looked like a relatively young doe. One of the things I take into consideration is one of the things I do for a living during the deer season is age deer. And so I have a good appreciation for how old the animals are. And from a table fare and different products, to me, there's a difference between a young deer and an older deer as far as what I'm going to choose to do more of the sausage and product type stuff versus the steaks. And obviously, in my opinion anyhow, the younger the animal, the higher quality the steaks are going to be. So one of the things the wildlife biologists do during especially the gun deer season is actually get the age off of the deer by looking at their teeth as they're coming through a meat processor. And so I do that with all the deer that I take, because knowing how old the animal is might determine whether or not it's going to be more sausage and wieners and bratwurst or more steaks. And so if it's a younger animal, to me, especially with an antlerless deer like this, if it's a year and a half old, to me that's the best, because it's an adult-sized animal with more meat than a fawn, but it's still young meat.
Oh, absolutely. And if anybody follows any meat market or meat industry, you ever hear of bologna bulls? And it's because the meat's pretty tough, because the animal's it's a male and they're a little more aggressive, and they tend to be pretty tough, so they use them for bologna. I've shot a couple nicer bucks in my day. They all turned into sausage. So I think we've learned a lot today, and I think we showed people a lot of little tricks and techniques for cutting a deer. We can finish this up a little bit later, and feel free to use this as a resource. Come back and visit often. If you fall into a snag as you're cutting up your deer, you can always come back online and check it out and maybe find a trick from what we taught you today.
Well, thank you, Larry, for taking us through this process. I've seen it a couple of times. Every time I learn something else. I'm sure the audience has as well. I hope this inspires you to take this step on your own. And thanks for joining us in Wild Wisconsin. We'll see you next time.
Seriously, be honest. It makes you hungry, right? Yes. Yes, it does. Check out this little video for this classic, yet completely classy venison recipe. Let's just say it pairs well with fun. And if that's not enough, listen to the Off the Record podcast on the Wild Wisconsin webpage with cookbook author and favorite DNR guest chef, John Motoviloff.